So how's everybody doing today? I'm Peter Danenberg from Google DeepMind. And just out of curiosity, does anybody know what these are? Does anybody want to take a guess?
Brain.
Brain? Yeah, that's beautiful. Right, that's exactly. So these are brain scans. And in particular, these are brain scans of people who are, this is an MIT study that came out a few months ago. These are brain scans of people engaged in, let's say, a problem solving and a creative exercise. And they divided these people up into 3 cohorts. So we have the pencil and paper people, we have the Google search people, and we have the LLM people. And if you had to guess, just out of curiosity, do you have any idea who the pencil and paper people are? What's that? Anybody? Which one? Oh, left. Interesting. Okay, that's an interesting guess. Anybody else? Turns out the pencil and paper people are on the right. And the funny thing about the pencil and paper people is you can see these really sort of beautiful high neurological activation in the middle. And I think this is where the pencil and paper people are struggling with the existential crisis of the blank page. In some sense, they're feeling this generational burden where they really have to come up with something from scratch, right? This is the ex nihilo. And at least historically speaking, I think this is where we used to put in our 10,000 hours. And not just any 10,000 hours, but this is where we used to put in our 10,000 quality hours to really achieve something like competence, something like mastery in any given domain, right? But if that's the pencil and paper people, who are the Google search people? Anybody? What's that? Oh, you think the left. So the funny thing is the Google search people are in the middle. And so the funny thing about the Google search people, this is a little bit interesting to me, is that they're almost the inverse of the pencil and paper people. So you can see this sort of general kind of activation a little bit in the middle. But I think what's different about the Google search people is that they're primarily involved in synthesis, right? So they have to take a look at these 10 blue links, they have to synthesize the information, and then there's a little bit of activation in the middle where they actually have to generate something. So anyway, by process of elimination, we have the pencil and paper, we have the Google search, and then the LLM people are on the left, right? Which is, anyway, I don't want to say it's a little bit sad, but the funny thing about the LLM people is that the brain is cool, almost inert, right? And I don't know if they kind of went and grabbed a cup of coffee, but in some sense, they've been unburdened from this synthetic, unburdened from this generational activity, this generational crisis. And the question I have is, what are the long-term effects of being in this state of neurological inertia? Like, how do we actually gain competence? How do we gain mastery if that's what we look like on vibe coding or whatever it is? And the bad news is, I think we're going to find out, right? Because sort of whether we wanted to or not, we're sort of enrolled in this wonderful collective experiment known as LLMs. And the good news is we have to pay for the privilege of participating. But anyway, in order to sort of figure out this question of how do we get competent in anything now that LLMs are around, in order to answer this question, I wanted to go back to Aristotle. And in particular, I reread Aristotle's Rhetoric a couple weeks ago. And I was shocked that he had this really fascinating dichotomy. And by the way, this is new to me. Has anybody heard of the poietic or the peirastic? The poietic or the peirastic? Anyway, the interesting thing about these is the poietic is what it's called. For Aristotle, that's really the art of rhetoric and generation. And in particular, for him, it's the art of generating words. And it just so happens that LLMs are fantastic at the poietic art of generating things, right? You know, sort of fluent text and compilable code and, you know, even sort of convincing hallucinations, right? So the poietic, that's where LLMs really shine. And the question is, you know, how do you interact with an LLM that's engaged in this sort of poetic thing? Typically what happens is they give you a little, you know, cue at the end of the spiel, which says, hey, bro, you know, do you want to know a little bit more about X, Y, and Z? But typically that's the extent of the interaction. So the peirastic, on the other hand, if the poietic is rhetoric, the peirastic, on the other hand, is dialectic. And for Aristotle, what that meant is the art of testing things. And just to illustrate that, you know, Socrates mentioned, when Socrates talks with people, he's a midwife of ideas. And what that means is when he gets together with somebody, he, instead of giving them an answer, instead of sparing them from the labor of thinking about things, his job is to actually help people birth their own ideas, right? And so sometimes he labors with them, he agonizes with them to help them give birth to their own ideas. And if he had sort of frustrated that process and just immediately given them what they wanted to know, there could have been a twofold tragedy. And the twofold tragedy is that without that process of giving birth to ideas, which requires a little bit of labor, a little bit of effort, a little bit of neural activation, number one, those ideas may never have come into existence in the first place. But number two, and this is the sort of worst part, it's possible that Socrates' companions may never have become the sort of people who give birth to ideas, right? In some sense, that's a little bit worse. And Socrates, Plato in the 7th letter describes this really interesting process where having engaged in a lifelong of dialectic or peirastic activity with somebody that you love, somebody that you trust, a sort of sparring partner in dialectic, this process happens which he calls the enkindling of the soul. And what that means is when you're engaged with somebody in this act of birthing ideas, for whatever reason, these ideas tend to be sort of neurologically sticky, they tend to be salient, they tend to stay with you for your entire life. And the question I have is, can LLMs be this peirastic companion? Can they actually challenge us to give birth to our own ideas? And I think, currently at least, the answer is kind of not by default, right? I think there's a sense in which if LLMs are fundamentally poietic in the sense that they're par excellence, their main thing is kind of generating words. I think there has to be possibly a fundamental retraining to create something like a peirastic LLM, which really challenges us to kind of grow beyond ourselves. And just a case in point, Microsoft did a study, this was a few months ago, and they noticed that engineers who tend to over-rely on these LLM-enabled tools, these LLM-enabled IDEs, they tend to outsource basically their faculty of critical thinking to the LLM. And what happens is that instead of critical thinkers, they tend to be sort of verifiers of information, which means that like little Roman emperors or whatever, their job is to basically do kind of thumbs up and thumbs down on autocomplete all day, right? And this paper, there was an interesting conclusion. At the end of this paper, the Microsoft paper, they mentioned that as creators of tools, we have a responsibility in some sense to make sure that we're actually challenging the users, that we're actually engaged in something with the user like a peirastic process where we're actually challenging the user to grow, challenging the user maybe to demonstrate mastery. And so the question of how do you accomplish mastery, how do you accomplish competence in the age of LLMs, I think it's twofold. So I think number one is users. I think we actually need to ask the LLM to challenge us, basically not let us off the hook, actually ask the LLM to force us in some sense to demonstrate mastery before they give us this poetic dish, with a little bit of kind of peirastic garnish. That's number one. But number two, I think as builders of AI tools, we actually need to fundamentally align the model to challenge the user. And by the way, even if that frustrates to a certain extent this dopamine cycle, which constitutes a lot of our engagement metrics, right? Because it may be the case that if you have a fundamentally peirastic LLM that's challenging you, that's asking difficult questions, there's a non-zero probability that that's slightly uncomfortable, right? But the upside is that if you have this peirastic LLM, if you can have this lifelong companion who's helping you grow, there's a possibility that we can create tools that really enkindle the soul. Thank you so much.